director of the center. I'm really happy that you're joining us today to talk with a very special guest, one of Howard's own. So we're really excited about her being with us today. That's Dr. Ashley Robertson Preston. And we'll be talking about her book, Mary McLeod Bethune, The Pan-Africanist. And so we're really excited to have Dr. Preston here this afternoon. Mary McLeod Bethune is one of my very favorite people in terms of to really consider and think about around Black education, the Black Women's Club movement, and so much more. In fact, in my class, Dr. Preston, I teach a course called Higher Leadership and Black Women. And I use two women to really propose a framework for thinking about Black women who lead institutions, and that framework is informed by the work of Mary McLeod Bethune and Lucy Dix Slow. So we're really excited. I'm really excited to talk with you about this important contribution to the literature. And so I want to begin by just asking you what inspired you to work to write this book. I know you've been deeply involved with Mrs. Bethune, as you indicated she wanted to be called, and I always think about my grandmother. She called her Mrs. Bethune, and I was always intrigued by that as a young person, but you made it so you were very clear about how that came to be the case, where she was certainly called that and expected to be called. But how did you decide? What inspired you to write this book, Mary McLeod Bethune, The Pan-Africanist?
Well, thank you so much for the invitation, Dr. Carter, and just for the great work that you all are doing through the center. I had an opportunity to sit in on some of the conversations you all had recently, and they were so good and coming at just the perfect time. So thank you so much. This book was inspired by my dissertation that I completed here at Howard, graduated in 2013 with my PhD from the history department, and proud to be back in the history department now as an associate professor. So this book started with, I think it was about 2010 when I was at Howard. Dr. Clark Lewis, who is in our department, one of my mentors, came to me to one of my classes, and she was like talking about public history and all of that, and I was like, okay. And she was like, you can get some jobs. I was like, okay, a job, great. I'm gonna go do public history. And she told me to go to the Mary McLeod Bethune Council House to do an internship, and I started doing an internship at the council house, and my focus was African diaspora history. So initially, when I started, I thought I wanted to do something on maybe the Black Panther Party or something, their international work. I did not think that there was enough material for me to do anything on Mrs. Bethune related to the diaspora. I just started working in the archives there, and it really just came together. The first two things that I saw was that she had went to Haiti in 1949, and I saw the Haitian Medal of Honor and Merit that she would wear. And then I saw that she went to Liberia in 1952. So those were the first two clues. And I thought, well, I don't know if that's enough to write a dissertation or what. So as I began to kind of dig more in the archives, because I was working as an archive technician, I saw all of this international travel. And that's where I kind of, started putting this book together. So it started as a dissertation, and over the years, I went to work at Bethune Cookman, running the Mary McLeod Bethune House there, and I met so many people who knew Mrs. Bethune, and so that is what led me to write Mary McLeod Bethune in Florida, because I wanted to capture the work that she had done there, but I also wanted to interview some of those elders that I met who were in their 90s, who talked about knowing her and working with her and seeing her on campus. And so the book kind of took a back seat, but I think it was important because I got to see, her work in Florida from a different perspective. So by the time I came back to finish the book, I had all of these different experiences of working in two of her homes and the archives. And so I think it really strengthened this project. Sometimes the dissertation is it's kind of hard to rework the dissertation into a book, especially when you're coming right out of the program. Sometimes you're just overwhelmed by everything. So I'm glad I took that break and examined other areas of her work over the years and came back to it. So that's where the book came from. Started right here at Howard. So
That's powerful. And I'm also reading another book that is about Mary McLeod Bethune around internationalism. And what is it? It's a collection of essays that also, and I really was struck by um, the Pan-Africanist title because I think that's so powerful, and how you came to that in terms of thinking about her. Can you talk a little bit about that as a Pan-Africanist? Hmm.
So, and the title, I'm so glad you said that because that's confirmation for me
Hmm. Hmm.
about the title because
Hmm.
I was thinking of all of these different things. I was thinking the leanings, the Pan
Hmm.
Africanist leanings of
Hmm.
and then I just said, you know what, Mary McLeod Bethune, the Pan
There
Africanist.
you
We're
go. I
gonna
love
leave
it.
it at that. We're gonna drop the mic and walk away because I wanted people to sit with that. Like, what does that mean in terms of how we see her? um, how did she come to this conclusion? And so, even in a dissertation, I talk about Pan Africanism a little bit, but I was really afraid to call her a Pan Africanist because at the time, before all of these works that have, talked about women in Pan Africanism, it was really just like uh, the scholarship was just blossoming around 2012, 13. And so I decided that with this book, I had to say it because it's going to pave the way for other Black women to be called Pan Africanist also. And so I call her a Pan Africanist because one of the themes that I see in all of her travels and her writings is solidarity. She is looking to bring um, African people of African descent together. She is traveling, and as she travels, she is talking to them and comparing their situations to African Americans and finding all of these similarities in their struggles. And when she returns to the United States, she writes in the Chicago Defender. She's a columnist for the Chicago Defender, and she's encouraging Black people to go to these places and go to Haiti, go to Liberia, go to Cuba. And she organizes NCNW, and there is a focus even on international activism and learning and engaging. She enlists the help of people like Sue Bailey Thurman, who is the wife of theologian Howard Thurman. But she has her to organize a trip to Cuba. They also have the Afro American Journal, which the journal is distributed around the world. I mean, they even have it in different languages. Certain parts of it are in different languages because they want to reach people of African descent around the world. And so she is really promoting solidarity among people of African descent in a very powerful way. I mean, and she uses her voice to speak on behalf of people of African descent. Also, when we see her at the founding of the United Nations, she's speaking against colonization. So, she is just, um, she was just so ahead of her time. And I'm still just in awe of how she could be in so many places at one time um, and doing so much great work. Um, I think it challenges all of us to just do more with what we have.
Absolutely. And you know what? Your book really, again, we think about Mary McLeod Bethune often in terms of being founding an institution, certainly being a part of Roosevelt's kitchen cabinet, and certainly the preeminent club woman. But you really bring that to life in ways that we often don't think about. we think about club women, I'm usually thinking about America. I'm not thinking about what that meant globally. And
Mhm.
when describing her travels and her desire to travel and the impact that travel had on her, and then through her on others is really, really quite amazing. And so I really love the way you situated. You thought about you wrote about the other folks who are oftentimes associated with Pan-Africanist thinking and thought being also associated with men. I mean, you
Mhm.
talk about Amy Garvey and others. I thought it was very powerful, and I love certainly the discussion about is it Sally Thurman's role?
Sue Bailey.
Sue Bailey, right? Sue Bailey, and certainly her husband. I'm thinking about her connection to her husband, but again, very, very powerful. So when I think about Mary McLeod Bethune, certainly at the HBCU Center, we're very concerned about research just writ large about uh, Black people and certainly Black women and others, but also about HBCU. So, in terms of Mrs. Bethune's work as the founder of what becomes Bethune-Cookman College, how do you think that factored into her work, her impact?
So, one of the things that I discuss in the book is Bethune Cookman and her welcoming international students, particularly students from the Caribbean. There was a really good book by, oh goodness, I'm missing his name. His last name is Gurdy. But it looks at the relationships between African Americans and Afro Cubans. And that was actually when I was working on a dissertation when I saw that book and I saw her there traveling to Cuba. And also, I saw her relationship with one of her students who was Afro Cuban. That kind of, tipped me off also to some of the other work that she had done. But at Bethune Cookman, she really created space that welcomed people of African descent from other countries. As students, she had a number of Afro Cuban students who attended the school. She also welcomed people like Madam Pandit, who was from India, but she would have her to come to talk to the students. She had played an important role in the fight for freedom for India, and so her and Mrs. Bethune began working together. They meet at the founding of the United Nations, and she brings her to Bethune Cookman to speak to the students about her experiences of being a freedom fighter in India. And so it's this very welcoming space for people throughout the diaspora. And she promotes those types of connections at her school. And so I think it is very similar to other HBCUs. If we really, unpack some of the work that we've done, you see it as a safe haven for people of African descent, particularly during segregation. Where else can you come to be educated besides HBCUs? And it's not just about being in these spaces alone, but also for us to learn from each other, for us to be concerned about each other's issues. And we see people like Kwame Nkrumah, who comes to the United States, and he goes to school in oh my goodness, Lincoln University. He goes to Lincoln University. And
Mhm.
so when he goes back to Ghana and he's in power in Ghana, you see all of these African Americans who are going to Ghana. People like Maya Angelou, W.E.B. Du Bois is able to bring his expertise at the end of his life. Having worked on all of the civil rights in the United States, everybody knows Du Bois, and he's able to go to work with Kwame Nkrumah, working on writing history. And, just his wife, Shirley Graham Du Bois, is able to work with Nkrumah also. She brought an amazing background. So that relationship of working with African Americans has started, with him being at his HBCU. So, how do we foster more of those types of relationships in which we're not just in the same space, But even when, if you go back home or wherever, we can continue to work together for the greater good. And that's what we see with Mrs. Bethune. You know, she is really working to foster these relationships throughout the diaspora and even at her school.
Another, I love that response. I think it's so important and so evident. And oftentimes we don't really think about how powerful those connections were and are. And I think they
Mhm.
continue in many ways. And I wonder what that, one of the things I was so struck in terms of your book is you talked about how proud she was. And you know, used her own words to describe how proud she was to not only be Black, there was issues in terms of her skin color, but also her connection to the African continent and other places. I mean, she was very clear about how important that was for her own sense of self. And when
Mhm.
I think about that, is there a way at HBCUs or other institutions we can impart that to others so that they feel like there's viscerally and actually there's some connection between their faiths and the faiths of Africans throughout the diaspora?
Well, I think one important way that we have been doing it, and I'm so glad that we have this strong push for study abroad at Howard University. I would love to see this at even more HBCUs, and not to say that we're the only ones that are doing it, but I know what Howard is doing right now because our department is doing a trip to Ghana this year, well, 2025, and they did Ghana last year, 2024, spring break also. So I think that's an important way to build bridges is for these students to not only learn about it, but to also go in person and actually see for themselves and not just see, but also be welcomed. You know, there's something about going to some of these places, having been to Ghana myself and to Egypt and South Africa, you'll be surprised at how welcoming they are. You know, it's like they're waiting for you to come back home. And so I think our students need to feel that. It changes you. Traveling and meeting and seeing with your own eyes, it definitely changes it, changes everything once you know, go back. That place is going to be on your mind. You know, I've been there before. And then while you're there, you know, having the opportunity to connect in different ways, not just as a tourist, but learning about the history and the culture and meeting people at those other those universities. Sometimes I think the students went to a university, but you know, I think study abroad is so very important. That we, you know, support that initiative, and that's an important way for our students to see, you know, and to build those bridges. Um, but you know, also just learning more about um, what's going on in the world. I think our Howard students, they're so socially conscious, but I think also just encouraging students to be globally minded. You know, how does all of this impact the world? What are the similarities in our struggles? How are we working to create change, not just for ourselves, but people of African descent who may not, you know, we may not ever meet? So, yeah, I think just teaching them to be globally minded also is so important.
I agree, and I agree with the study abroad piece. And also, I have a huge picture in my office of Mary McLeod Bethune in the center, and she's flanked by Du Bois and Horace Mann Bond, which is and there's a part in your book where you mention, I think there's a picture of Du Bois in um, Mrs. Bethune, but not of Horace Mann. And I'm always trying to figure out where they were, okay, where they took this picture. And so it was very interesting. But I want to ask you a question about women and how they're perceived intellectually in other ways. Because even, you know, certainly Du Bois was one of the greatest thinkers of our times and of our time and so forth. But and when we think about Mrs. Bethune in terms of her contribution, um, it is really amazing as a thinker, in addition to being an organizer and a mobilizer and a person proud of what it means to be Black and connected, a Pan-Africanist. So I wonder why why you think we have it, even though we know about her, and certainly in the I know the last time I visited the African American Museum, there's a wonderful whole section devoted to her and her work. But just in terms of thinking about us, our students, and even some of us as scholars, and when you think about intellectual sort of influencers, sometimes her name isn't mentioned among those. When what you've documented here is clearly the case that she continues to influence the thinking of a whole generations of intellectuals. I wonder, what do you think accounts for that?
Why she has not been recognized?
Mm-hmm.
I think there are a couple of issues here. I think the scholarship, for one. When I started doing this in 2010, there were not a lot of books on Mrs. Bethune. Scholarly books. There was Building a Better World, which was an edited book. There was the other one on her political activism. That was about maybe 3 or 4 books dedicated to Mrs. Bethune. And now with the work that I've done, Dr. Ida Jones, who used to work at Howard in Moreland, who's now Morgan State's archivist. She did Mary McLeod Bethune in DC. Um, the new book that Dr. Rooks, Noliwe Rooks at Brown, who I'm co-teaching a class on Mrs. Bethune with, her book is a new book on Mrs. Bethune. So I think the scholarship is going to help people to see her in her rightful place in history. Books and writings are so very important. And she herself didn't really have, she didn't really write her own autobiography. So I think that's another piece is like she didn't she didn't write her own book for people to kind of like, I think that's an important part of recognition because you see people like Mary Church Terrell who actually wrote her own book. So like I think that's a part of her not being recognized. Also, that time period in which she lived is a time period that we don't focus on a lot. It's like you hear about slavery, barely Reconstruction. Like we kind of skip over all of that. We kind of focus on Harlem Renaissance, and then we jump on into the civil rights movement. So that I think I don't have a problem with the civil rights movement at all being taught, but I think we have like exhausted. Sometimes we can kind of get exhausted with civil rights, and we miss people like Mrs. Bethune. We miss people like A. Philip Randolph. um, we miss like that those in between years, and they were the people who really laid the foundation for the civil rights movement. And so we get really kind of caught up on that, and we don't peel back the layers to see like, oh, okay, Black people have been fighting oppression for years. Like it wasn't a new thing that we just started it during the civil rights movement. It has been ongoing. And so I like this idea of the long civil rights movement, and really opening our eyes to see people like Mrs. Bethune as a civil rights leader. And lastly, I would say that, for the time period that she lived, the people that we mostly look at are like Du Bois, for example, who was one of her contemporaries. But I say that I think that it's a new day because this scholarship that is starting to come out now, we're seeing more Black women in the forefront, and we're seeing more Black women historians, who are writing more work than ever. So this is just it just took time. We had Black history first, and then it took time to get to the women's stories. So I'm glad to be a part of, this era.
Right, and I'm glad you are too. And I love that explanation because that's very powerful, Dr. Preston, because you're so right. When we think about that period, let's say even 1910 to 1950 or whatever, that is really, even when you think about, and all the people we can name, during that period. But there's not a lot of scholarly work that really focuses on them and their work and their lives in the context of that time. Is really very important, because even when I think about all the things you wrote about in terms of Mrs. Bethune and her work, a lot of that is not captured in other spaces and places. We know a few folks talk about their work. Not that their work was not is not uh, that doesn't deserve scholarly attention, but certainly she cuts across so many areas, and that influence so many people to do the work as you described in the civil rights period, that we don't think about what it was like before, in that swath of time. That's a very powerful, um,
And I'll
comment.
add to that, club women. I mean,
Really?
the importance of the club
Oh
women and
yes,
the work that
exactly.
they
That's
did,
right,
I
exactly.
still don't think they've gotten enough,
No,
credit for the amazing things like National Association of Colored Women,
exactly.
creating kindergarten
That's
programs
right,
and
exactly.
daycares, and I
Right.
mean, building playgrounds,
That's right.
like just amazing work, standing
Amazing.
against lynchings, and I
Right.
mean,
Exactly.
suffrage movement. I mean,
Suffrage
they
movement.
were
Exactly.
all there, um, and I even I said when VP Harris was running for president, I said, people have talked about Shirley Chisholm, but when are people gonna talk about Mary McLeod Bethune, who paved the way for Shirley Chisholm? And Shirley Chisholm, loved Mrs. Bethune and always spoke very highly of her. And when her statue, the Bethune Memorial in Lincoln Park, was dedicated, I think 50 years ago, it has been this year, Shirley Chisholm was a part of that. So, we have to go back, a little further in the history sometimes.
We really do. And it is so incredibly important that we do, because that missing gap tells a lot about what we know today. And as you're saying, the club movement, there's a wonderful book. I use it. I used to use it in one of my classes around. It's got a wonderful picture of um, Mary McLeod Bethune, Legina Burns Hope, and
Oh, I know exactly
like,
what you're talking about. It's like
yes,
summer sitting and summer
yes,
standing.
yes,
Yes.
exactly. Right, right. Because again, that club movement is so critically important. As you mentioned, NACW, and many others, including NC. I mean, that whole club and how these women were very much involved with community uplift and support and so forth. And some people might even argue, I know when we're having these discussions now in the midst of, post-election reflection, is that the interesting thing about the club movement is that even though many of the women involved were perhaps from the middle class or educated women, whatever, they were certainly working with the entire community. And more of our organizations that did that are not as either not as present, or we don't see them in the same kind of ways. We don't see the responsibility to engage each other in our communities, regardless of class or whatever we want to call it. Very, very important. So you're exactly right. That club women's movement is extremely important in understanding ultimately what happens during the civil rights movement and beyond. So,
Mhm.
yeah,
And we're gonna need to know some of this stuff. We're gonna have to look back at some of this stuff. We're gonna need this in the next few years. I
we
promise.
really will. We really will. And I think we've suffered some losses because we've moved away from that in some ways. And so even our organizations, certainly NCNW still exists and certainly
Yes.
does work, and so incredibly important. And we even think about not only Mrs. Bethune, but certainly the folks her successors, Dorothy Height and others, in terms of the work that they continue, and then others beyond that, and Genetico being the most recent NCNW. I know there's a new one president, but again, that legacy is so extremely important. So appreciate this work, and this renewed focus on Mrs. Bethune. It's so needed. Um, Also, I was in a conversation earlier today, as I mentioned, and this conversation about how we can support each other as women, and certainly as Black women in the academy, I think is critically important. And so, anything from doing this work that you would you that sort of comes to mind about how we can support and sustain and promote each other as Black women in the academy?
Oh, I could do a book on Mrs. Bethune and the women that she worked with. I mean, how she empowered other women, how she entrusted her organization with women. Like I mentioned, Sue Bailey Thurman earlier, everything that she accomplished, she did it with the women in her community and the women who she was able to build bridges with. And what I love about the research that I've seen is that it's not that they didn't have differences. It's not that they were perfect people, because she would get mad and write letters, and they would get mad, and they would. But at the end of the day, the goal was to uplift the Black community. So even with her and Mary Church Terrell, when she started NCW, Terrell said, "I don't know. I don't even see a need for another organization, like flat out, because she has, been president of NACW and all this. Like, we have NACW, but she supported it anyway. And, ultimately, she worked with Mrs. Bethune in NCNW and all of that. But, putting our issues aside for the greater good of the Black community. And so, how do we get back to that? How do we, have our issues, but also say, you know what, at the end of the day, we got to roll up our sleeves and get this work done. And how do we empower other women in the ways that she did? There's so many women who I've encountered in Daytona, and all of those elders who say, yeah, she's the one that told me to do this or that, or she's the one that got me this opportunity. Like, when I see her writings, for example, to First Lady Roosevelt, people talk about their relationship as them being like, friends or whatever. It was, first of all, it was very political. Not to say that they weren't, close, but Mrs. Bethune was writing her asking for other opportunities for other women, um, other men also, but we see a lot of her using her power to bring other women along, hosting meetings at the White House. There's a group of Girl Scouts, Black Girl Scouts, who were able to come to the White House to meet the First Lady. She is always about paving the way for other women, leaving that door open so that they can also come through it. And so, are we doing the same thing that she's doing? How do we take some of these lessons and make sure that we are implementing them and continuing her legacy, and building on the work that she did? So I just think she's amazing. And I love just her relationships with the women that she works with. I mean, from her school, an all girls school, to founding NCNW, to the last years of her life traveling abroad to these various places. And everywhere she goes, even when she's, invited by the government or things like that, she makes sure that she meets with women's organizations. When she goes to Canada, she meets with the Hour a Day Study Club. I always mess up their name. I have to say it slow. But that this club is actually still around. And I have a woman in the book, who remembers Mrs. Bethune coming to Canada. So, she's traveling there for Emancipation Day, but she's also meeting with these women who host this luncheon, and she shares, her wisdom about starting her school and, fighting for civil rights. And so, always very mindful of, women, and making sure that she is, empowering them wherever she is.
That's very powerful. And again, there's so many nuggets, to say the least, in your book that I think, wow, this could be, and one was the organization. I was thumbing through my copy trying to find the acronym, but it was like ID. It has something to do with International Women of Color. Can you talk a
Hmm.
little bit about that organization? Because I was really, really found that very interesting. Hmm.
So
Is it
it's a very short part of the book. It's the
right?
International Council of Women of Darker Races.
Darker, yes, that's what it was.
Yes.
Yes.
So there are members of the National Association of Colored Women, with who, alongside Mrs. Bethune, people like Margaret Murray Washington, Booker T. Washington's third wife, and a phenomenal club woman. And there's a great book by Dr. Sheena Harris Hayes on her. But you see her working with Margaret Murray Washington and others to start this International Council of Women of Darker Races. And basically, they are an organization that wants to discover and find out more about issues that are impacting women of African descent around the world. And I say this, I think that this is kind of like it opens her eyes to, the needs. For example, they create study clubs. They start learning more about, the history and culture of people in other places. They invite women from Haiti and India to join them. They also send a delegate to Haiti. At the time, the United States was occupying Haiti. And so they are sending someone there because they want to know, what are the conditions that women and children are facing in Haiti during this occupation. So they're very, concerned about people of African descent around the world and trying to see how they can use their privilege, to assist these women who are in other places. So yeah, this is like one of the first times I think that it really opens her eyes to, some of the issues. And from there on, we see her, traveling to Cuba and all of these different places after being involved with the organization. You're muted.
Sorry, I muted. Sorry. One of the things I did early on was to look at Black professional associations during segregation, and really found it was so important that those networks and supports were in place because they really helped to establish sort of a professional identity around agency and self-determination in ways that were lost when many of these organizations sort of integrated or really were, sort of were integrated into other institutions and really lost their particular focus. And so her work with starting these organizations or being a part of the founding and then being a part of them, I think is so very important in terms of really not looking for external affirmation, and really relying on herself and others who shared her experiences. So I found that very powerful. The other thing I wanted to mention is that this whole thing about the club movement, even though there's been some, or no, no, not club movement, I mean, study groups or literary societies, and their relationship to civil rights ultimately, or sort of building these networks and connections. And she was a part of. You talked about several that she was a part of, and I think looking at those study groups or literary societies or these folk with opportunities to come together and engage with people in the community about things that they might not otherwise be exposed to. And so I'm really interested in that as well in terms of her own development, in terms of her work.
Yeah,
Um, Go ahead.
even NCW, you see them creating like an international relations
Mhm,
um, uh, section of NCW, and they're inviting Howard faculty members to come be a part of this, to present and talk to them about, their
mhm,
travels.
mhm,
I can't remember his name, but it was a professor who had just come back from Cuba, I think, and he talks about, his trip there, what he learned. And
mhm,
so we also see this relationship between Mrs. Bethune and Howard University, with NCNW
mhm, mhm,
certainly
mhm.
founding.
That's right.
Lucy Diggs Slow's office was
Mhm,
the address was used
sure,
initially,
sure.
for, I think it was the office or something that was used for the founding of NCNW. But she sees Howard and she's like, okay, I see a HBCU right here up the street.
There you go. Absolutely,
I'm
absolutely.
gonna call y'all and
Mhm,
lean into that expertise. And I think that's important, as we get out of these, we need to get out of these four walls and, not just use this expertise and this information for ourselves, but how are we imparting this knowledge to others. So she challenges them to do it, and they do.
Absolutely. And I certainly was going to bring us to Howard with Lucy Dick Slow and, the work that Amy
Oh
Amy
yeah.
Yaboa
Oh,
Kwakami is doing her recent book around Lucy Dick Slow and others. And there's certainly some letters. I mean, there's the other book, the first book about Lucy Dick Slow, Faithful to the Task at Hand, with Ann Pruitt and
hmm
Carol Little. There's some letters between Mrs. Bethune and Lucy Dick Slow. So even again, all of these relationships cut across institutions and regions and show a shared sort of kinship. I think that's extremely important
hmm
to highlight when we think about our work today. And certainly some of the researchers that you listed earlier, talked about earlier in terms of their work, and how all of that together really, I think, is a way to examine the impact of these women collectively and then certainly individually. But as you think about your work, this book, Mary McLeod Bethune, the Pan-Africanist, are there particular things that you learned that you like to highlight that you think, listen, someone reads this book, I want them to walk away with these things in mind?
Um, I just hope that people will be inspired by Mrs. Bethune, just looking at, where she came from, how she was able to accomplish, so much and touch so many lives. I mean, I think it should inspire all of us to, be more like her. We
Mhm,
just have access to so much more. And
mhm,
like, how is it she had access to less and was able to accomplish so much? That's
mhm,
the question I'm always,
mhm.
asking. Like, how can we do more with what we have given her circumstances? I also hope that it would challenge people to be more globally minded, if not Pan Africanist, at least more globally minded, in thinking about the issues that people are facing around the world, and like how do we use our privilege in America to touch other people's lives. What can we do individually? Because if all of us think about how we can change things on an individual level, things will be changed. So how can we do more? Whether it's supporting different organizations, traveling abroad and supporting people, like how do we do more of that? And I will say, in the last few years, I've seen more people traveling and going abroad. But even with the traveling, make sure that we're intentional about the travel that we're doing. Not just for travel's sake. Um, is there a way to give back while you're doing all of this? So.
And I think being a Pan-Africanist, I think you've really done a good, uh, your work is fabulous, but I think demystifying the term Pan-Africanist, I think is so incredibly important. And to hold Mrs. Bethune as an example of a Pan-Africanist, I think makes it more accessible in terms of ideology, but also in terms of practice. What does it mean? What's it look like in every way? Um, she demonstrated, right, what that really meant, and you really brought it to life for us here. So I really do appreciate it because as you were talking, I thought about it. I said, she's so right there. The reason why I guess this work is so compelling in a variety of ways is because we haven't seen it before, right? There's not a lot of really scholarly work out there about Mrs. Bethune and the connection through to these other scholarly traditions or these folks that we recognize, readily recognize in events. And I know this may be a small point, but for me, I'm thinking, how in the world was she doing all that traveling? Right, exactly. Just the whole what it takes is, someone in the 21st century could travel to Africa. We travel to Africa, you're thinking that took something. What does that take? What did that take then? What did it take to do a 4-month tour in Europe? I mean, what's that look like? Right.
hmm
And so,
and I always used to tell my students at Bethune Cookman, get a passport. you should not leave college without having a passport.
That's right. That's right.
Just on a very basic level, just get it. It's one of those things that, you don't think you need it until you need it.
You
And you're
need
like,
it.
oh, I gotta do what to get that?
That's right. That's
So,
right. It takes this week's one exactly. Mm-hmm.
yeah. So, even things like that, we can
Mm-hmm.
do that very easily now.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so yeah, and there's also a new book, and this is a side note, by Dr. Barbara Savage on Mers Tate, who
Oh,
was
okay. So
a
how yeah.
faculty member, yeah, at Howard. But I thought about her because there was a program named after her that helped students get past.
Yes, yes, yes,
Um,
yes. And I did, you certainly mentioned Merz Tate in this book as well.
yeah,
Yes, absolutely, exactly. And also, and I'll close on this because I could talk to you all day, and we'll certainly have you again, but certainly have an opportunity to talk with you in the future. But also, one of the things that encourages me daily is the focus on Africa. Because I want to make it the right focus, meaning that it's the largest population and the youngest population, right? And so when we think about the diaspora and where we are in terms of globally and what the opportunities are for all of us. I mean, they are amazing and certainly rich and robust, and certainly engaging that. If that means traveling, that means connecting, that means being prepared. Intellectually and socially and all the other kind of ways to understand that we're part of a large global community and that means something, right? And we have work to do with that. So I'm really encouraged by this work and the example of Mrs. Bethune. Any closing thoughts for us, Dr. Preston?
um, I thank you all for the opportunity just to, share about the book and just to just share space with you. This has been a great conversation.
Mm,
I hope that people, even if they don't read the book, will learn something about Mrs. Bethune. I mean, she's so inspiring, and in teaching about her life, I have been able to teach about different things as far as like World War II. She just was so connected to so many things. She picked the first 40 women who were in the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, and they were the first women to serve in the armed forces in roles other than nurses. So, like, she's just a great person to study,
sure.
because you'll find out different things about just African Americans' contributions to this country in general. So it's been a wonderful ride to write about her, study her, and to work in two of her homes. And I just want to continue to write more about her because, as you said, or as we talked about, with the scholarship, there has not been enough. And so my goal is really to write more about Mrs. Bethune and to make more people aware of her. And this semester, I have the opportunity to teach a colloquium, co-teach a colloquium with Dr. Nolaway Rooksett Brown, and our students are learning about Mrs. Bethune. It's a class
Sure.
dedicated to Mrs.
Oh,
Bethune.
I love it.
That has been a great experience. So I just hope more people will learn about her and, continue the work that she did.
Well, great. Well, we certainly have enjoyed having you this afternoon on Turning Pages. We're really excited about the work that you're doing and will do on Mrs. Bethune, and we look forward to reading about it, learning more about her, and actually to sort of building our own our capacity, our collective capacity to serve and our communities and our world. So again, Dr. Ashley Robertson Preston, um, professor here at Howard University in the Department of History. We had a great time talking about her work and look forward to talking with her further in other settings about the work she's doing and will do. So again, thanks so much for joining Turning Pages. We look forward to sharing our next episode with you. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Okay, I think we're done. Thank you so much, Dr. Preston.